If my driver hadn't deliberately ignored my street that night, I would have unlocked my front door and walked straight into a man who had already decided I wasn't supposed to live long enough to tell anyone what I knew. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 62 years old, and this happened in Chicago. 6 months earlier, I stood beside a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial watching my husband, Robert, take his final breath. We had been married 40 years. Robert was a public school teacher who loved American history so much he could make teenagers care about it. I worked quietly as a legal records clerk, one of those invisible jobs that only matters when something goes wrong. When Robert died, the life insurance barely covered the hospital bills. What remained vanished into property taxes, utilities, and the reality of living alone. I moved back into our small brick bungalow on Chicago's south side. The paint was peeling, the streetlight outside flickered, and the silence inside the house felt heavier than any noise. Our son lived in Colorado. We talked sometimes, but distance turned small gaps into canyons. Retirement wasn't possible. I needed income. So I took a night job at a private legal document archive downtown. It wasn't glamorous, just climate-controlled rooms full of sealed case files, depositions, settlement agreements, and evidence records. My job was simple: log files, verify chain of custody, and flag inconsistencies. It paid just enough to keep the lights on. My shift ended at 11:45 p.m. For years I took the bus until the city cut the late route. Walking several blocks alone at midnight wasn't appealing, so my son insisted I download a rideshare app. That's how I met David. The first night his dark blue sedan pulled up outside the archive building. I hesitated before getting in. The street was empty. He looked mid-50s, tired eyes, careful posture like someone who had lived through injuries, but his rating was perfect. "Long night?" he asked. "Every night," I replied. He nodded like that explained everything. Over the next weeks he kept accepting my rides. Same nights, same time, same quiet presence. He wasn't chatty, but he noticed things. If my hands were shaking, he turned up the heater. If I was quiet, he didn't force conversation. Around October, I started bringing chamomile tea to work. One night I poured an extra cup and handed it to him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," I replied, "but nights are long." The habit stuck. By November, those 12-minute rides were often the only conversations I had all day. David began remembering small details: my flickering porch light, the nights my street felt too quiet. At the time, I thought it was simple friendliness. What I didn't realize was someone else had started paying attention to me too. David rarely started conversations, but when he did, they mattered. One night he told me he used to be an electrician for commercial towers until a scaffolding collapse crushed 2 vertebrae. Now he drove nights and checked on his mother each morning as her memory slowly faded. He never complained. But I noticed something else. David remembered patterns. Which nights I stayed late. When the security guard took smoke breaks. One evening as we turned down my block, he slowed slightly. "There's a sedan across the street I've seen a few times," he said. I laughed it off. Cars live on streets forever in Chicago. He didn't argue. Around that same time, I was helping with an internal audit at the archive. At first it was small inconsistencies, files that didn't match digital records, settlement numbers quietly altered. Most cases involved vulnerable plaintiffs, elderly tenants, injured construction workers, immigrants who barely spoke English. A few percentage points, shaved off settlements. Individually small. Together, enormous. David listened carefully whenever I mentioned the audit. What I didn't know was that weeks earlier he had driven a passenger who talked far too much when drunk. A man in his 40s with an expensive watch and a habit of speaking loudly on the phone like the driver didn't exist. During one ride, the man complained about someone in records asking too many questions about files and audits. At one point he repeated my street name 3 times like he was memorizing it. David remembered. By January, our routine felt automatic. I'd leave the archive at 11:45. David would be waiting. One evening I noticed a man standing under a streetlight near my corner, pretending to scroll through his phone. "That's the 3rd time I've seen him this week," David said. Unease rippled through me, but I convinced myself it meant nothing. A few days later, my front gate was slightly open when I got home. I was sure I had latched it that morning. Inside, A legal pad from my kitchen counter was missing. Mostly grocery lists, but one page held case numbers and dates from work. David didn't like that. "If anything else feels off," he said quietly, "tell me." What I didn't know was that he had already started writing things down: license plates, dates, conversations from certain passengers, especially the drunk man who kept mentioning audits. The night everything changed began like any other shift. Rain blurred the streetlights across the windshield as I climbed into the back seat and handed David his tea. 2 blocks before my house. He kept driving. "You missed Maple Street," I said. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need you to stay calm." My stomach dropped. He pulled into an empty office parking lot and shut off the engine. Rain tapped the windshield. "Do you recognize the name Gregory Hale?" he asked. The name hit me instantly. I had seen it in the archive. "I've driven him 7 times this month," David said. "Always drunk. Always talking about someone pulling files." My pulse pounded. He handed me his phone. "Because last Friday night," he said your full address out loud. My blood ran cold. "She's the one pulling files," David repeated. Notes filled the screen, dates, fragments of sentences. "She's careful, but she's not invisible." "There's more," David said. "He said you work nights. He said your house is empty Tuesdays and Fridays." I could barely breathe. "Before picking you up tonight, I drove past your block." "Why?" "Because he mentioned tonight being a good time." Rain hammered harder. "His car was parked across from your house," David said. My heart slammed. "I watched him get out." The world tilted. "I watched him walk to your gate." My voice barely worked. "You saw him try my door?" David nodded slowly. "He didn't get inside. But he stood there looking through your window." "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. His answer came instantly. "Because I'm not taking you home tonight." We sat listening to the rain. Then he started the engine. "Where are we going?" I asked. "The police station." But first he drove through side streets for 15 minutes to make sure no one was following us. In an abandoned grocery lot, he asked me to explain the audit. So I told him everything: altered settlements, vulnerable victims, money disappearing in small amounts that added up to hundreds of thousands. David showed me his notes again. Then he played a recording. A drunken voice filled the car. "She's careful, but she's slow. If she figures it out, she'll talk." The recording ended. "He thinks I have proof," I whispered. "Yes," David said. "And even if you don't, he thinks your house is where the answers are." Then something clicked in my mind. "Gregory Hale works nights too," I said slowly. David looked at me. "He's security at the archive." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he drove straight to the police station. The officer listened as I explained the audit, the open gate, the man under the streetlight. Then David handed over his notes and recordings. When the officer heard Gregory Hale's voice, his expression changed. Recognition. A detective joined us. "Gregory Hale works contract security," he said, "rotating sites." "Where?" I asked. He looked directly at me. "Your archive building." Suddenly, everything made sense. He didn't need to break in. He already had keys. Then the detective slid a photograph across the table. My husband stood in it, young, smiling beside another man, Gregory Hale. Years earlier, Robert had testified in a civil fraud case that destroyed Hale's contractor license. Hale had never forgotten. Police moved quickly that night. A warrant was issued. When they searched his house, they found hundreds of altered legal documents, evidence tampering that diverted more than $500,000. They also found photographs of my house, my gate, my back door, and a list labeled contingency, my name, tonight's date. They arrested him on his way back to my neighborhood. The trial came months later. I testified about the audit. David testified about the rides. When the recordings played, the courtroom went silent. The jury returned a verdict faster than anyone expected. Guilty on all counts: financial fraud, evidence tampering, stalking, attempted unlawful entry. Gregory Hale will likely never walk free again. People asked if I felt relieved. But relief doesn't come quickly after fear like that. It arrives slowly, like sunlight after a long winter. I eventually moved back into my house. The police installed better locks and lights. David still drives nights. Only now I sit in the front seat. We talk more about his mother, his estranged son, and how the worst mistake someone can make is ignoring quiet warning signs. One night, his son called after seeing the news about the trial. The driver who noticed something wrong and refused to ignore it. David pulled the car over and cried. Sometimes the truth hurts, but sometimes it opens doors. Now we have dinner together most Sundays. Slowly, he and his son are rebuilding something that had been broken for years. And me? I'm 63 now. I still work nights. I still drink chamomile tea when my hands shake, but I no longer believe I'm alone in the quiet. Sometimes I sit on my porch and think how easily this story could have ended differently. If I hadn't offered a stranger a cup of tea. If he hadn't listened to conversations others ignored. If he hadn't decided one night to miss my street. Kindness didn't save my life because it was heroic. It saved my life because it created connection. Connection creates awareness. Awareness leads to action. And sometimes, action is the only thing standing between routine and tragedy. So, pay attention to people, be kind to strangers, and never assume the quiet moments in your life are unimportant. Because one small act like offering someone a cup of tea might be the reason you're still alive to tell the story later.